morning air near the harbor carried the smell of salt, rain, and engine smoke. Gray clouds hung low above the water, making everything feel colder than it really was. Workers pushed heavy carts across the docks, while tourists gathered near the fences to watch the naval ships parked along the shoreline. Loudspeakers crackled every few minutes, announcing arrival times and security reminders nobody seemed to fully listen to. In the middle of all that noise, Lena stepped off an old city bus with a faded backpack hanging from one shoulder. She paused for a second after reaching the sidewalk. Her legs felt weak from the overnight trip. She had barely slept. Every time the bus hit a bump in the road, her head knocked lightly against the window, pulling her awake again. Even now, dark circles sat under her tired eyes. Still, she took a slow breath and looked toward the harbor. Far ahead, large Navy ships stood silently in the water like giant steel buildings. Flags moved gently in the wind above them. Crowds were already gathering near the main entrance where today's ceremony would take place. Lena adjusted the strap on her backpack and carefully touched the paper folder she carried against her chest. It was still there. That mattered. The folder looked old at the edges, protected inside a clear plastic sleeve that had been taped more than once. She held onto it tightly as if losing it would mean losing the only proof she had left. People brushed past her without noticing. A businessman talking loudly into his phone nearly bumped her shoulder. Two teenagers rushed by laughing over something on a screen. A woman carrying coffee hurried toward the harbor gate with a little boy holding her hand. Nobody paid attention to Lena. She seemed invisible among the morning crowd. Her shoes were worn from years of use, and her dark jacket looked too thin for the weather. A small stain marked one sleeve. Her hair had been tied back quickly before sunrise, but loose strands now moved across her face in the wind. She looked like someone carrying a long story nobody had asked to hear. Lena slowly walked toward the harbor entrance. The closer she got, the more security she noticed. Metal barriers lined the sidewalks, and uniformed officers stood near every gate checking IDs and invitations. Today's naval ceremony was clearly important. Large banners hung from poles near the water. Reporters adjusted cameras nearby while workers rushed to prepare final decorations. Even from far away, Lena could hear music playing softly from speakers near the stage area. She stopped near the edge of the crowd and stared quietly at the ships again. For a brief moment, her expression softened. It had been many years since she last stood near a harbor like this one. Memories returned slowly, carried by the sound of gulls overhead and waves touching the docks. Cold nights, emergency lights reflecting across dark water. Faces full of fear and exhaustion. She swallowed hard and forced herself back to the present. This was different. At least she hoped it was. A young volunteer wearing a blue event jacket walked nearby handing out small paper programs. He smiled politely at people as they passed. When he reached Lena, he hesitated slightly before offering one. "Ma'am? Program for the ceremony?" Lena blinked, almost surprised someone was speaking to her directly. "Oh," she said softly. "Thank you." The volunteer handed her the paper. His smile faded just a little as he noticed how tightly she held her folder. "You okay?" he asked carefully. Lena nodded quickly. "Just tired from traveling. Long trip." "Very." He looked like he wanted to ask another question, but someone called him from farther down the sidewalk. He waved apologetically before jogging away. Lena looked down at the program in her hands. On the front was a photograph of naval officers standing proudly beside a large ship. Underneath it were the words, "Annual Harbor Recognition Ceremony." Her eyes stayed on the page longer than necessary. Then she folded it carefully and placed it inside her backpack. A sudden gust of wind moved through the harbor, colder than before. Lena rubbed her hands together and continued toward the main gate. Two officers stood there checking guests one by one. "Invitation?" one asked each person entering. Most people flashed printed passes or showed digital tickets on their phones before walking through without trouble. When Lena reached the front of the line, she carefully removed the plastic-covered folder from her arms. "I believe my name should be on a guest list," she said quietly. The taller officer barely looked at her before holding out his hand. ID first. Lena handed over her identification card. The officer examined it with a tired expression while the second officer glanced at the growing line behind her. Purpose for attending? The taller one asked. I received a letter invitation, Lena explained. I was told to arrive before 10. You have the letter? It's inside the folder. Her fingers shook slightly as she opened it. Several papers rested inside, carefully organized despite their age. Newspaper clippings, old photographs, folded documents. Finally, she found a white envelope with an official Navy seal printed in the corner. She handed it over. The officer opened it quickly, scanning the page with narrowed eyes. Something about his expression changed. Not softer, more confused. He looked at Lena again, this time longer than before. You came alone? Yes. From where? A small town north of Briar County. The officer exchanged a glance with his partner. Behind Lena, a few impatient people sighed loudly. Well? Someone muttered. The taller officer handed back the letter slowly. You'll need to wait here. Lena's stomach tightened. Is something wrong? Just wait. He stepped aside and spoke quietly into a radio attached to his shoulder. Lena stood silently near the barrier while nearby guests continued walking through security. Some glanced curiously in her direction before moving on. Minutes passed. The wind continued growing colder. Lena could feel people staring now. She hated that feeling. Her hands folded tightly around the folder again. A little girl walking past with her parents looked up at Lena and smiled politely. Lena managed a small smile back, though it disappeared quickly. Finally, another officer approached from inside the gate area. This one looked older and more serious than the others. His uniform was neat, his posture stiff. What seems to be the issue? He asked. The taller officer handed him the invitation letter. This woman says she was invited personally. The older officer read the letter carefully. Then his eyes moved toward Lena. There was no warmth in his expression, only suspicion. You're Lena Vale? Yes. And you expect us to believe this invitation is real? Lena blinked in confusion. I don't understand. The officer folded the paper once. This event is restricted. High-level guests only. I know, Lena replied quietly. That's why I brought the letter. Where exactly did you get this? It was mailed to me 3 weeks ago. The officer stared at her worn backpack, old shoes, and tired face. Something in his expression hardened. People nearby had started slowing down to listen. Lena noticed. Her cheeks grew warm with embarrassment. I was told someone here requested my presence, she explained carefully. Maybe there's been a misunderstanding. The officer gave a short, humorless laugh. A misunderstanding? He repeated. He stepped closer. Who do you think you are? He snapped loudly enough for others nearby to hear. The crowd became quieter almost instantly. Lena froze. The words hit harder than she expected. Not because of the volume, because she had heard that same tone before. Many times. The tone people used when they decided your appearance told them everything worth knowing. The officer continued speaking before she could answer. You walk in here carrying old papers and expect access to a military ceremony? Lena opened her mouth softly. Sir, I'm not trying to cause trouble. Then stop acting like you belong behind those gates. Several people nearby exchanged uncomfortable glances. One younger officer looked uneasy but stayed silent. Lena lowered her eyes for a moment. She could feel every stare around her now. The cold air suddenly felt heavier. Still, she kept her voice calm. I didn't come here for attention, she said quietly. I only came because someone asked me to. And who exactly would ask for you? Before she could answer, the officer handed the letter back sharply. I suggest you leave before this becomes a bigger problem. Lena grabbed the folder before it slipped from her hands. For a second, it looked like she might actually turn around and walk away. Part of her wanted to. The long bus ride, the exhaustion, the humiliation building in her chest. It all pressed down on her at once. Maybe coming here had been a mistake. Maybe the letter had been sent by accident after all. Around her, people slowly resumed moving through the gate, though many still looked back curiously. Lena stepped aside near the harbor railing. The water below moved gently against the docks. She stared at it quietly while gripping the folder against her chest. Her eyes looked glossy now, though she refused to cry. Not here. Not in front of strangers. Behind her, the officer shook his head dismissively before returning to security checks. But something unexpected happened then. Far down the street near the main road, several black vehicles suddenly turned toward the harbor entrance, one after another. Large government SUVs. The movement caught everyone's attention immediately. Conversations slowed. Security officers straightened their posture. Even the officer who had yelled at Lena turned toward the arriving vehicles with sudden alertness. The black SUVs rolled closer until they stopped near the gate. Doors opened almost at once. Men in formal military uniforms stepped out first. Then another figure emerged slowly from the center vehicle. An older admiral with silver hair and sharp eyes. The atmosphere around the harbor changed instantly. People whispered nervously. Cameras turned toward the scene. The admiral barely acknowledged the crowd as he adjusted his gloves and looked toward the entrance. Then his eyes stopped, directly on Lena. And for the first time that morning, her name was about to mean something to everyone standing there. The harbor entrance had been noisy all morning, but now an uneasy silence spread through the crowd. Even the gulls circling above seemed quieter as people turned toward the line of black government vehicles parked near the gate. The older admiral stepped out slowly, his polished shoes touching the pavement with calm confidence. Several officers followed behind him, along with aides carrying folders and radios. The admiral's uniform was covered with ribbons and medals that reflected the gray morning light. Everyone near the entrance straightened immediately. The officer who had shouted at Lena a moment earlier quickly adjusted his posture and moved toward the admiral with visible nervousness. "Sir," he greeted firmly. But the admiral barely looked at him. His eyes stayed fixed on Lena. For a second, nobody moved. Lena herself looked confused. She still stood near the harbor railing, clutching her old folder against her chest, uncertain whether she should stay or quietly leave before drawing more attention. Then the admiral began walking directly toward her. People instinctively stepped aside to clear a path. The crowd watched in complete silence. The officer near the gate suddenly looked uneasy. His confident expression from earlier had disappeared. Lena swallowed hard as the admiral stopped in front of her. Up close, he looked older than she expected. Deep lines marked his face, and his silver hair moved slightly in the wind coming off the water. But his eyes were steady and warm. For a moment, he simply stared at her as if confirming something important. Then, to everyone's shock, his serious expression softened completely. "Lena Vale," he said quietly. Hearing her full name spoken like that made her blink in surprise. The admiral gave a small smile filled with emotion that seemed difficult to hide. "You actually came." Lena looked down briefly, almost embarrassed by the attention surrounding them. "I wasn't sure I should," she admitted softly. The admiral shook his head immediately. "No," he replied. "You absolutely should have." Murmurs spread through the nearby crowd. The officer who had yelled earlier stood frozen several feet away, clearly unsure what to do now. One reporter whispered to another while adjusting a camera lens toward Lena. The admiral noticed the tension around her almost instantly. His eyes shifted briefly toward the officers near the gate. "What happened here?" he asked calmly. Nobody answered at first. The younger officer lowered his gaze. Finally, the older officer cleared his throat awkwardly. "Sir, there was confusion regarding identification procedures." The admiral's face remained calm, but disappointment appeared in his eyes. "Confusion," he repeated quietly. He looked back toward Lena again. "Were you kept waiting long?" Lena hesitated. She clearly did not want trouble for anyone. "It's all right," she said gently. "They were only doing their jobs." The officer looked relieved for half a second. Then the admiral answered without taking his eyes off Lena. "There's a difference between doing a job and forgetting how to treat people." The words were not loud, but they landed heavily. The older officer's face grew red with embarrassment. Nearby civilians pretended not to listen while listening very carefully. Lena shifted uncomfortably under everyone's attention. She hated being the center of a scene. The Admiral seemed to realize that immediately. His voice softened again. "You look tired," he said. "The bus was delayed twice. You should have called someone." Lena gave a small smile. "I didn't want to bother anyone." The Admiral let out a quiet breath that almost sounded emotional. "That sounds exactly like you." For a moment, neither of them spoke. People nearby exchanged confused looks. Nobody understood who this woman was or why one of the country's most respected naval leaders seemed personally moved just by seeing her. The Admiral finally gestured toward the entrance gate. "Come with me," he said. "They've been waiting for you inside." Lena looked startled by that sentence. "They?" He nodded. "There are people here who never forgot what you did." Before she could respond, another official hurried over holding a tablet. "Admiral, the press schedule." "It can wait," the Admiral interrupted calmly. The official stopped speaking immediately. That only deepened the curiosity around Lena. Who was she? Why was an Admiral delaying official schedules for her? The Admiral motioned again toward the gate, and this time Lena slowly followed beside him. As they approached security, the older officer stepped aside quickly without saying a word. Lena could feel his embarrassment. Part of her wanted to reassure him again, but she stayed quiet. The Admiral stopped briefly before passing through the gate. He turned toward the officers one last time. "Every person who walks toward these gates carries a story," he said evenly. "Never assume you can see all of it." Neither officer answered. The Admiral continued walking. Inside the harbor grounds, the atmosphere felt completely different. Large white tents stood near the docks while uniformed sailors moved carefully between equipment and decorated seating areas. Flags lined the pathways, moving sharply in the ocean wind. A military band practiced softly near the main stage. Lena walked beside the Admiral in silence, still trying to understand what was happening. People saluted as he passed, but many also stared curiously at her. Some seemed confused seeing such an ordinary-looking woman beside someone so important. Others appeared to recognize her name after overhearing the conversation outside. The Admiral slowed his pace slightly. "I'm sorry about that officer," he said quietly. Lena shook her head. "He didn't know me. That shouldn't matter." She looked ahead at the harbor water. "A lot of people decide things quickly when they see someone like me." The Admiral's expression tightened slightly. "Someone like you?" Lena gave a faint shrug. "Someone tired. Someone older. Someone carrying old papers instead of expensive clothes." The Admiral stopped walking for a moment. Several aides nearly bumped into each other before stopping too. He looked directly at her. "Do you know what I see when I look at you?" Lena seemed uncomfortable by the question. The Admiral answered anyway. "I see a person who saved lives when everyone else was running away." Lena's eyes lowered immediately. "Please," she whispered. "Not here." The Admiral understood instantly. He nodded gently and continued walking without another word. Ahead of them stood a large Navy ship docked near the ceremony platform. Its steel surface towered over the harbor like a wall. Lena stared at it quietly. Memories returned again. Rain, dark water, emergency sirens, hands reaching through smoke and flooding. She tightened her grip on the folder slightly. The Admiral noticed. "You still carry those papers? They remind me that it really happened." He looked thoughtful for a second. "After all these years? Sometimes it feels like another person lived that life," she admitted. They approached a quieter area near the side of the harbor where fewer reporters could reach them. Security officers respectfully kept their distance now. The Admiral finally spoke again. "When your letter came back unanswered the first time, I thought maybe you moved." Lena looked surprised. "You sent more than one?" "3, actually." She looked genuinely shocked. "I never received them." "That town of yours barely receives mail on time," he muttered. For the first time, Lena smiled a little more naturally. The Admiral smiled too. It changed his entire face. making him look less like a powerful military figure and more like an old man relieved to see someone important after many years. "You disappeared," he said quietly. "I didn't disappear. You vanished after the storm." Lena looked out toward the ocean again. There wasn't much reason to stay. The Admiral seemed like he wanted to argue with that statement but stopped himself. Instead, he asked carefully, "Are you still working at the clinic?" "Part-time now." "And your mother?" Lena's expression softened sadly. "She passed away last winter." The Admiral immediately lowered his head slightly. "I'm sorry. She was peaceful at the end." Still, emotion flickered briefly across Lena's face before she looked away again. The Admiral gave her a moment. Around them, preparations for the ceremony continued. Chairs filled with guests. Photographers moved near the stage. Important officials arrived one after another. Yet somehow, none of it seemed more important to the Admiral than this conversation. One of his aides finally approached nervously. "Sir, the mayor has arrived. I'll greet him shortly. And the press is asking about the civilian guest beside you." The Admiral's expression hardened slightly. "Then they can keep asking." The aide nodded quickly and stepped back. Lena looked uncomfortable again. "You don't have to do this." The Admiral frowned. "Do what?" "Treat me like someone important." His answer came immediately. "You are." She looked down silently. The Admiral studied her face carefully then sighed. "You still don't understand what that night meant to people." Lena's voice became very soft. "I only did what anyone else would have done." The Admiral looked out at the harbor. "No," he replied quietly. "Most people wouldn't have." Before Lena could respond, movement near the main stage caught everyone's attention. More black vehicles had arrived, bringing additional officials and military leaders. The ceremony would begin soon. Crowds grew larger near the seating area. The Admiral straightened slightly. "There's someone else who wants to meet you today," he said. Lena looked confused. "Who?" But before he could answer, applause suddenly rose near the entrance as another senior officer arrived. The Admiral glanced toward the growing crowd, then back at Lena. His expression carried something mysterious now, something emotional. And whatever waited inside the ceremony was clearly much bigger than Lena had imagined during that long overnight bus ride. The harbor had fully awakened by late morning. The quiet gray sky from earlier was slowly giving way to thin sunlight breaking through the clouds. Reflections shimmered across the water beside the massive Navy ships, and rows of white chairs near the main stage were now almost completely filled. Reporters stood shoulder to shoulder behind security barriers, whispering to each other while adjusting cameras and microphones. Important guests moved through the decorated pathways wearing polished uniforms, dark suits, and formal dresses. Yet even among all the ceremony and attention, whispers about Lena continued spreading quietly through the crowd. People noticed the way Admiral Corwin stayed close to her. They noticed how officers immediately stepped aside when she walked near them. Most of all, they noticed how uncomfortable Lena seemed with every bit of attention. She walked carefully beside the Admiral, still carrying her worn backpack and old folder against her chest. Compared to everyone around her, she looked painfully ordinary, and somehow that only made people more curious. Near the main stage, a young Navy officer approached the Admiral with visible urgency. "Sir, they're ready for the opening presentation." Admiral Corwin nodded once. "I'll be there shortly." The officer glanced briefly at Lena before lowering his voice. "The press keeps asking who she is." The Admiral's expression remained calm. "They'll hear what they need to hear soon enough." The officer nodded respectfully and walked away. Lena looked uneasy again. "You really don't have to make this into something bigger," she said quietly. The Admiral looked at her with surprise. "Bigger? I'm not comfortable with crowds." "That hasn't changed." She gave a faint smile. "No." The Admiral gestured toward a quieter seating area beside the stage. "Sit here for a few minutes before things begin." Lena hesitated before sitting carefully in the front row near the aisle. People nearby immediately started recognizing that if she had been placed there, she must matter far more than they first assumed. Several guests discreetly glanced in her direction. Lena kept her eyes lowered. She could feel every stare. The Admiral remained standing beside her for a moment. "You all right?" She nodded softly. "You keep asking me that. Because you look like you might disappear at any second." That earned the smallest laugh from her. For a brief moment she seemed younger. Then the loud sound of microphones being tested echoed across the harbor. The ceremony was beginning. A military band started playing softly near the stage while guests settled into their seats. The large Navy ship behind the platform created a powerful backdrop against the water. Lena watched silently as officials took their places. She still did not fully understand why she had been invited, or why Admiral Corwin seemed personally determined to keep her there. A woman seated nearby finally leaned closer. "Excuse me," she whispered politely. "Are you family of one of the officers?" Lena looked startled by the question. "No," she answered gently. "Oh." The woman clearly wanted to ask more but stopped herself. A few seats away, two reporters quietly spoke to each other. "That's her." "You sure?" Corwin walked in with her personally. "But who is she?" "No idea." Lena pretended not to hear. The ceremony officially began moments later. A speaker welcomed guests and thanked military families for their service. Applause rose politely through the harbor after each introduction. Lena listened quietly, though her thoughts drifted elsewhere. Her fingers rested against the edge of the old folder in her lap. She hadn't opened it since entering the harbor grounds. Part of her didn't want to. The papers inside carried memories she rarely allowed herself to revisit. Rainwater, emergency shelters, faces she never forgot. She stared toward the ocean again. The sound of waves against the docks suddenly brought back another memory so strongly that her chest tightened. A little boy wrapped in a blanket, crying. Cold rain hitting broken pavement. Someone yelling for help through darkness. Lena blinked quickly and forced herself back into the present. On stage, city officials continued giving speeches about leadership, courage, and sacrifice. Most guests listened politely. Some checked their phones under their seats. Others quietly chatted when cameras moved away. But then something changed. Admiral Corwin stepped toward the podium. Instantly, the atmosphere shifted. People straightened in their chairs. Reporters raised cameras. Even the harbor workers nearby paused to listen. Corwin thanked the audience briefly before becoming unusually quiet. For several seconds, he simply looked across the crowd. Then he spoke again, slower this time. The applause seemed to last forever. Lena sat frozen in her chair while hundreds of strangers stood around her clapping with genuine emotion. Some people smiled warmly in her direction. Others wiped tears from their eyes after hearing Admiral Corwin's story. The sound echoed across the harbor water and bounced off the giant Navy ships behind the stage. But Lena looked overwhelmed by all of it. Her hands trembled slightly around the old folder resting in her lap. She kept shaking her head softly, as if the crowd had mistaken her for someone greater than she truly was. The young woman beside the podium smiled through tears. "You still do that?" she said gently into the microphone. Lena blinked. "Do what?" "Act like what you did wasn't important." A few quiet laughs spread through the audience. Lena looked down again, embarrassed. Admiral Corwin stepped closer to the microphone. "Many people serving today wear medals," he said calmly, "and they earn every one of them. But courage does not only belong to uniforms." The crowd applauded again. Lena wished they would stop looking at her. The attention felt too heavy. For years, she had lived quietly in a small town where almost nobody knew about the Briar Coast storm anymore. She worked part-time at a local clinic, helped elderly neighbors with groceries, and spent evenings caring for her late mother before she passed away. That was her life now. Simple, quiet, safe. Nothing like this. A reporter near the front finally raised a hand carefully. "Admiral Corwin, may we ask Ms. Vale a few questions afterward?" Before Lena could panic, the Admiral answered firmly. "Only if she agrees." Several cameras immediately turned toward her. Lena looked startled. I don't really have anything to say." The young woman beside the podium smiled softly. "That's exactly why people should hear from you." Lena gave her a helpless look that almost made the audience laugh again. The Admiral gently motioned for everyone to sit. As the applause faded, the ceremony continued, though the atmosphere had completely changed now. Guests no longer seemed distracted or formal. The story had reached them personally. Even city officials who earlier appeared focused only on schedules and speeches now watched Lena with curiosity and respect. The next presentation began, but people continued whispering quietly about her. That's the volunteer woman? She stayed during the storm? Corwin searched for her all these years? Lena heard pieces of the whispers and felt smaller with every minute. She leaned toward the Admiral quietly. Please don't tell more stories. Corwin looked amused. Why not? Because half of them probably sound bigger than they really were. His expression softened. That's not true. Before she could answer, another elderly man seated nearby turned toward her slowly. His gray beard shook slightly as he studied her face. Excuse me, he said carefully. Lena looked at him politely. Were you working near Dock 8 during the floods? She nodded slowly. The man's eyes widened with recognition. You helped my wife. Lena looked confused. She had pneumonia during the evacuation, he explained. The shelters were overcrowded. Nobody could find medicine. His voice cracked slightly. You sat with her until sunrise. Lena searched her memory carefully. Faces, rain, crowded shelters. Then suddenly she remembered. A coughing woman wrapped in blankets while her husband begged volunteers for help. Lena's eyes softened. She wore a green scarf, Lena said quietly. The old man immediately smiled in disbelief. You remember that? Lena gave a faint shrug. She kept apologizing for being difficult. The man laughed emotionally while wiping one eye. That sounds exactly like her. People nearby listened closely now. The man shook his head slowly. She passed away 4 years ago, he said softly. But she used to talk about you all the time. Lena's expression fell gently. I'm sorry. She would have been happy to know you were honored today. Lena didn't know how to respond. The old man reached forward and squeezed her hand once before turning back toward the stage. Lena stared down silently afterward. She had not expected any of this. Not the applause. Not the stories. Not strangers remembering details she herself had nearly forgotten. The ceremony paused briefly for guests to move toward the reception area near the harbor tents. Waiters carried trays of coffee and pastries while reporters quietly searched for interviews. Lena immediately looked for the nearest exit. Admiral Corwin noticed at once. You're trying to escape. I'm trying to breathe. That made him smile slightly. You can hide near the water if you want. Reporters usually avoid the wind. She almost laughed. Almost. Corwin nodded toward the quieter edge of the harbor. Go. I'll handle everyone else. Lena stood carefully, still holding her folder. As she moved away from the crowd, several guests stopped her briefly to thank her or shake her hand. She responded politely every time, though she clearly remained uncomfortable with praise. One middle-aged woman hugged her unexpectedly. My brother survived those shelters, the woman whispered emotionally. Thank you. Lena hugged her back gently but looked close to tears again afterward. Near the edge of the harbor, away from cameras and applause, the air finally felt calmer. The ocean stretched endlessly before her while smaller boats moved slowly across the water in the distance. Lena rested both hands against the cold metal railing and closed her eyes. The wind brushed against her face. For the first time all day, she felt silence. Well, a voice behind her said awkwardly. This is probably the part where I apologize. Lena turned slowly. It was the officer from the entrance gate. Without the crowd around him, he looked far less confident now. His posture was stiff, and embarrassment sat heavily across his face. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The officer glanced toward the water before finally sighing. I handled this morning badly. Lena looked at him quietly. You were doing your job. No, he admitted. I was making assumptions. She stayed silent. The officer rubbed the back of his neck uncomfortably. When I saw you standing there, he hesitated. I thought you were confused about the event. Maybe trying to get inside because important people were here. Lena gave a small nod. That's fair. No, it isn't. His honesty surprised her. The officer looked genuinely ashamed now. I spoke to you like you didn't belong near those gates. Lena turned her eyes back toward the harbor water. A lot of people do that. The officer swallowed hard. That may be true, he said quietly, but it shouldn't become normal. His voice carried enough sincerity that Lena finally looked back at him. He seemed younger now somehow. Less like the harsh officer from earlier and more like a tired man realizing something uncomfortable about himself. I embarrassed you in front of everyone, he continued, and instead of getting angry, you protected me afterward. Lena frowned slightly. Protected you? You could have told the Admiral exactly what I said. She gave a tired little shrug. What would that fix? The officer didn't answer immediately. Far behind them, applause rose again from the reception area after another speech began. The officer glanced toward the sound briefly. You know, he said carefully, I almost didn't believe the stories either. Lena looked confused. The stories from today. She gave a faint smile. Neither do I sometimes. He studied her face for a second. That's strange. What is? People usually want credit for things. Lena looked out across the harbor again. When the storm happened, nobody was thinking about credit. Her voice became distant now, almost lost in memory. People were cold, frightened. Families were separated. Children were crying everywhere. The officer listened quietly. There wasn't time to think about being recognized later, she said softly. You just helped whoever was in front of you. For several seconds, only the sound of waves filled the silence between them. Then the officer asked something more carefully. Why did you disappear afterward? Lena smiled sadly at the water. I didn't disappear. But Admiral Corwin said they searched for you. She looked down at the folder in her hands. My mother got sick not long after the storm. I moved back home to take care of her. The officer's expression softened immediately. She needed me more than interviews did. He nodded slowly. Suddenly, the folder slipped slightly from Lena's arm as the wind picked up. Several photographs scattered onto the ground. Oh! The officer quickly bent down to help gather them before the wind carried them away. As he picked one up, he froze. The photograph showed a crowded emergency shelter during the storm years earlier. Volunteers moved through rows of frightened families under dim lights. And near the center of the picture stood a much younger Lena, holding a sleeping child in her arms. The officer stared silently at the image before carefully handing it back. His voice became quieter than before. You really were there through all of it. Lena gently placed the photograph back into the folder. Yes. The officer looked genuinely emotional now. I judged you in less than 30 seconds this morning. Lena closed the folder carefully. That's enough time for most people. The words were not angry. That somehow made them hit even harder. Before the officer could respond, a voice suddenly called from behind them. Lena, she turned. The young woman from the stage, the Admiral's daughter, was walking toward them slowly, holding something small in her hands. And judging by the expression on her face, there was still another part of the story Lena had not heard yet. Lena turned slowly when she heard her name again. The harbor wind had grown stronger now, carrying the sound of distant waves and faint music from the ongoing ceremony behind them. Most guests were still gathered near the reception tents, but this corner of the dock felt almost separate from everything else. The Admiral's daughter stood a few steps away, holding a small folded item in both hands. Her expression looked calmer now than earlier, but there was something serious in her eyes, like she had been carrying a thought for a long time and finally decided to release it. Lena noticed it immediately and felt a quiet tension return to her chest. I'm sorry, the young woman said softly as she approached. I didn't mean to interrupt. It's all right, Lena replied gently. The officer who had apologized earlier stepped aside slightly, unsure if he should stay or leave. After a brief hesitation, he chose to remain nearby but silent. The young woman stopped in front of Lena. I wanted to give you something, she said. Lena looked down at the object in her hands. It was an old folded piece of paper, carefully preserved inside a clear plastic sleeve, similar to how Lena kept her own documents. "What is it?" Lena asked. The young woman hesitated for a moment, then handed it over. Lena took it carefully and unfolded it slowly. It was a drawing. Simple, slightly faded with age, clearly made by a child. It showed a small figure sitting beside a hospital bed while a child slept peacefully under a blanket. There were messy lines representing rain outside a window, and a bright circle that was probably meant to be a lamp above the bed. Lena stared at it for a long time. Her breath slowed. The memory returned instantly, sharper than before. She remembered sitting beside that same bed during the storm night. The little girl had refused to sleep unless someone stayed near her. The power had flickered constantly. Rain had hit the windows so hard it sounded like something breaking outside. And at some point during that night, the child had asked for paper. "I drew this after I got home," the young woman said quietly. Lena's eyes lifted slowly. The young woman smiled faintly, though her eyes were glossy again. "I was 8, she added. "I don't remember everything clearly anymore, but I remember you staying there." Lena swallowed hard. "I didn't do anything special," she said softly. The young woman shook her head immediately. "You stayed," she replied. "That's what I remember most. Everyone else was running around. Everything felt loud and scary. But you just stayed." The officer standing nearby lowered his gaze. Even he seemed affected by the words. Lena carefully folded the drawing again, holding it with more care than before. "I kept this all these years," the young woman continued. "My father said one day I might meet you again." She glanced toward the Admiral in the distance, who was still speaking with officials near the reception area. "He never stopped looking for you," she added. Lena looked overwhelmed again, shaking her head slightly. "I don't understand why," she said quietly. The young woman stepped closer. "Because you were there when it mattered most." There was no dramatic tone in her voice, no exaggeration, just simple truth. That made it harder for Lena to dismiss. A long silence settled between them. Then the young woman smiled softly again, though this time it was mixed with sadness. "There's something else," she said. Lena looked up. The officer nearby seemed to sense the shift and stepped even further aside, giving them space. The young woman took a slow breath. "After the storm, my father filed reports trying to find every volunteer who worked at Dock 8. Lena nodded slightly. "I know. But there was one report he never completed." Lena frowned slightly. "What do you mean?" The young woman looked down briefly before answering. "There was a missing name in the records." Lena blinked. "A missing name?" "Yes," she said. "Someone important to the evacuation efforts wasn't officially recorded. Not in the final list. Not in the recognition files. Not anywhere." Lena felt a strange discomfort rising in her chest. "That happens sometimes," she said slowly. "Records get lost during emergencies." The young woman nodded. "That's what my father thought too." She paused. "But then he started asking people directly." Lena watched her carefully. "And?" The young woman looked directly at her. "They all described the same person." Lena's voice softened. "Me?" The young woman shook her head. "Not just you." That confused Lena. The officer nearby looked equally puzzled now. The young woman continued. "They described someone who organized people during the worst hours. Someone who made decisions when officials were overwhelmed. Someone who directed emergency movements when communication systems failed." Lena frowned slightly. "That sounds like a coordinator or an officer," she said quietly. "It does," the young woman agreed. She hesitated again. "But no official record ever matched that description." Lena looked uncomfortable. "I was never in charge of anything like that," she said firmly. "I know," the young woman replied quickly. "That's not what I'm saying." The wind shifted again, carrying a colder breeze across the dock. The young woman looked uncertain for a moment, then finally spoke more carefully. "My father believed there were unofficial responders that night," she said. "People who stepped in without being assigned roles. People who made decisions because there was no time to wait for orders. Lena stayed quiet. The officer nearby slowly crossed his arms, listening closely now. The young woman continued. There were reports of someone moving between shelters coordinating transport routes. Someone making sure children were moved first during evacuation. Someone directing medical volunteers when radios stopped working. Lena's heartbeat slowed slightly. That wasn't me, she said quietly. The young woman didn't argue. Instead, she nodded. My father didn't think it was just one person, she said. He thought it might have been a small group. Lena looked relieved for a second, but the young woman's next words changed that. However, everyone described the same voice. Lena froze. The same voice? She repeated. Yes, the young woman said gently. Calm, clear, not loud but steady. People said it made them feel like someone was still in control, even when everything was falling apart. The officer nearby slowly looked toward Lena again, now with a different expression. Confusion mixed with something deeper. Lena shook her head slightly. I don't remember that, she said honestly. I was just helping where I could. The young woman studied her face carefully. I believe you, she said softly. Lena let out a quiet breath. But my father always said something strange, the young woman added. Lena looked up again. He said whoever that person was. They disappeared before sunrise. A silence followed that felt heavier than before. Lena looked down at the drawing in her hands again. The simple picture now felt different. Not just a memory, something layered underneath it. The officer finally spoke quietly. Are you saying there was an unidentified coordinator during the evacuation? The young woman nodded slightly. My father never proved it officially, she said. But he never stopped believing it. Lena's voice became gentle again. I think people remember things differently when they go through something like that. The young woman didn't disagree. Instead, she smiled softly. Maybe. She paused, then added something unexpected. But there's one thing I know for certain. Lena looked at her. You stayed. That sentence felt final. Not dramatic, just true. Lena lowered her gaze again, unable to respond. From the reception area behind them, the Admiral's voice could be heard faintly as he continued speaking with officials. The ceremony was still ongoing, though it now felt far away from this quiet moment near the water. The young woman took a small step back. I didn't come here just to give you that drawing, she said. Lena looked up again. I wanted to tell you thank you properly, she continued. Not as someone speaking in front of cameras. Not as a guest. Just as the child who remembers being safe because someone refused to leave. Her voice cracked slightly at the end. Lena shook her head gently. You don't need to thank me for that. I do, the young woman insisted. The officer quietly stepped forward again. I think a lot of people do, he said carefully. Lena looked uncomfortable again. I didn't expect any of this, she admitted. The young woman gave a soft smile. Most people who do important things don't. That made Lena pause. She looked toward the harbor water again, watching it move steadily against the dock. For a moment, she seemed lost in thought. Then she spoke quietly. I came here thinking it was just an invitation, she said. I thought maybe someone remembered a volunteer from a long time ago. She shook her head slightly. I didn't expect it to feel like this. The young woman followed her gaze. Like what? Lena hesitated. Like I've been living a life I don't fully recognize anymore. The words hung in the air. The officer didn't interrupt. The young woman nodded slowly, as if she understood more than she could explain. From a distance, the Admiral finally noticed the group standing near the water. He began walking toward them slowly, his expression unreadable from afar. Lena saw him approaching and straightened slightly. The young woman also turned. The officer stepped back respectfully. When the Admiral reached them, he looked at Lena first, then at the drawing in her hands, then at his daughter. For a brief moment, no one spoke. Finally, he said quietly, Did she tell you about the record? Lena looked surprised. You knew. The Admiral nodded once. I suspected it for years, he said. But suspicion is not proof. He looked out at the water for a moment before continuing. Some people don't appear in official history, he said. But that doesn't mean they weren't there shaping it. Lena held the drawing a little tighter. The Admiral turned back to her. You may not remember everything, he said gently. But too many people remember you the same way for it to be coincidence. Lena looked overwhelmed again. I was just trying to help, she whispered. The Admiral's expression softened. Then maybe that's exactly what history forgot how to record. Silence settled again, but it was different now. Not heavy, just thoughtful. The wind moved across the harbor one more time, carrying distant applause from the ceremony still continuing behind them. And Lena stood there, holding a child's drawing from a life she thought she had already left behind, realizing that some parts of the past had never truly stopped following her at all.